The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as William made his way through the familiar corridors. He had returned earlier than expected from his official visit to Scotland, hoping to surprise Kate with an early homecoming. The palace felt unusually quiet, with most of the staff attending to their morning duties in the East Wing. As he approached their private quarters, William noticed something peculiar. The door to Kate's study was slightly ajar, and he could hear muffled voices coming from within. His wife's voice was barely audible, but there was another voice he didn't immediately recognize. The tone seemed serious, almost urgent. William paused outside the door, not wanting to interrupt what might be an important meeting. Kate often held private discussions with palace staff or charity representatives in her study. However, something about the atmosphere felt different today. The conversation seemed more personal, more intimate than a typical business meeting. He decided to wait, leaning against the wall in the hallway. Through the gap in the door, he could see Kate sitting at her desk, her posture tense and rigid. Across from her sat a woman he had never seen before, elegantly dressed but with an air of desperation about her. The stranger was leaning forward, speaking in hushed but emphatic tones. The woman appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat chignon. Her clothing suggested wealth and status, but her hands trembled slightly as she gestured. William found himself straining to hear their conversation, though he couldn't make out specific words from his position in the hallway. Kate's responses were brief, mostly nods or short sentences. Her face was pale, and William noticed she kept glancing toward a manila envelope that lay on the desk between them. The envelope appeared thick, as if it contained multiple documents or photographs. As the conversation continued, William saw Kate reach for a tissue. Her composure, usually so perfect in public situations, seemed to be cracking. The stranger reached across the desk and placed her hand over Kate's, speaking with what appeared to be genuine concern and urgency. The scene troubled William deeply. In all their years together, he had rarely seen his wife look so distressed during what appeared to be a private meeting. Kate was known for her grace under pressure, her ability to handle difficult situations with dignity and strength. Whatever this woman was telling her was clearly having a profound impact. William checked his watch and realized he had been standing in the hallway for nearly 20 minutes. The conversation showed no signs of ending, and he began to wonder if he should announce his presence or continue waiting. The protective instinct in him wanted to enter the room and ensure Kate was all right, but he also respected her privacy and independence. Just as he was about to knock and announce his arrival, he heard footsteps approaching from the other end of the corridor. One of the palace staff members was walking toward him, carrying what appeared to be important documents. William quickly moved away from the door, not wanting to appear as though he had been eavesdropping on his wife's private meeting. He decided to retreat to his own office and wait for Kate to finish her meeting. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening behind that door. The image of Kate's distressed face and the mysterious envelope remained etched in his mind. In his office, William tried to focus on the stack of correspondence waiting for his attention, but his thoughts kept returning to the scene he had witnessed. Who was this woman? And what could she possibly have to tell Kate that would cause such obvious distress? The envelope on the desk particularly bothered him. Official palace business rarely involved such secretive-looking packages. An hour passed before William heard movement in the hallway outside his office. He opened his door slightly and saw the mysterious woman walking toward the palace exit, escorted by one of the security staff. She moved with purpose but seemed emotionally drained, her earlier urgency replaced by what looked like relief mixed with concern. William waited a few more minutes before making his way back to Kate's study. He wanted to give his wife time to compose herself if needed, but he also couldn't ignore his growing concern about what had transpired during that meeting. When William finally approached Kate's study door, he found it completely closed now. He knocked gently and heard his wife's voice, though it sounded strained and different from her usual warm tone. She called for him to enter, and as he opened the door, he immediately noticed the change in the room's atmosphere. Kate was still seated at her desk, but the manila envelope was nowhere to be seen. She had clearly made an effort to compose herself, but William could see the telltale signs of recent tears in her slightly reddened eyes and the way she avoided making direct eye contact with him initially. "Darling," "You're back early," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How was Scotland?" "I wasn't expecting you until this evening." William studied his wife's face carefully as he approached her desk. "The meetings finished sooner than expected," he replied, settling into the chair that the mysterious visitor had recently occupied. "I thought I'd surprise you. Was that a charity representative you were meeting with? I saw someone leaving as I arrived." Kate's hands fidgeted with a pen on her desk, and William noticed a slight tremor in her fingers. "Yes, something like that," she answered vaguely. "Just some routine palace business. Nothing that would interest you." The dismissive nature of her response troubled William. Throughout their marriage, Kate had always been open about her meetings and responsibilities. They regularly discussed their various charitable commitments and official duties with each other. This evasiveness was completely out of character for her. "Kate, are you all right? You seem upset about something." William pressed gently, leaning forward in his chair. "If something's troubling you, you know you can talk to me about it." For a moment, Kate's carefully constructed composure wavered. She looked directly at him for the first time since he'd entered the room, and William saw a depth of emotion in her eyes that alarmed him. There was fear there, but also something else he couldn't quite identify. Sadness, perhaps, or maybe disappointment. "I'm fine, William." "Really?" she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's just been a long morning and I have a slight headache. Perhaps I should rest before the children come home from school." William knew Kate well enough to recognize when she was deflecting. In their years together, she had only shut him out of important matters a handful of times, and each instance had involved something that deeply affected their family. The pattern was familiar, but no less concerning for its familiarity. "What was in the envelope?" he asked directly, deciding that a straightforward approach might be more effective than dancing around the issue. "I noticed you had some documents on your desk when I walked by earlier." Kate's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale and she looked down at her hands, which were now clasped tightly together in her lap. The silence stretched between them for several long moments, and William could practically see his wife's internal struggle playing out across her features. "What envelope?" she finally asked, but the question came out weak and unconvincing. "I don't know what you mean." William felt a chill run down his spine. Kate was many things, but she had never been a good liar, particularly not to him. The fact that she was attempting to deny something he had clearly observed suggested that whatever had been in that envelope was significant enough to make her abandon her usual honesty with him. "Kate, I saw the manila envelope on your desk when I passed by your study earlier. The woman you were meeting with seemed quite serious about whatever she was showing you." "What's going on?" His wife stood abruptly from her chair, turning away from him to face the window that overlooked the palace gardens. Her posture was rigid, defensive, and William could see her shoulders shaking slightly. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated the tension in her stance. "Some things are better left alone, William," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some secrets are kept for good reasons." The word secrets hit William like a physical blow. In all their time together, they had built their relationship on trust and open communication. The idea that Kate was keeping something significant from him, something that had clearly distressed her deeply, was almost incomprehensible. "What kind of secrets?" he asked, standing and moving toward her. "What could possibly be so serious that you can't share it with me?" Kate didn't turn around, but William saw her reflection in the window glass. Tears were streaming silently down her cheeks, and her hands were pressed against the windowsill as if she needed the support to remain standing. "The kind that could change everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The kind that could destroy what we've built together." William felt his heart racing as the implications of her words sank in. Whatever information that woman had brought to Kate was clearly something that threatened their marriage, their family, or perhaps even their public standing. The weight of unknown possibilities pressed down on him as he reached out to place a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder. When Kate felt his touch, she finally broke down completely, her careful composure crumbling as she turned into his arms and began to sob openly against his chest. William held Kate close as she wept, feeling helpless in the face of her obvious anguish. Her tears soaked through his shirt and he could feel the trembling of her entire body. Whatever burden she was carrying was clearly enormous, and her attempt to bear it alone had pushed her to this breaking point. "Kate, please," he whispered into her hair, stroking her back gently. "Whatever this is about, we can face it together." We've been through difficult times before, and we've always come out stronger on the other side." But Kate only cried harder at his words, as if the promise of his support somehow made the situation even more painful for her. She pulled back from him slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You don't understand, William," she said between shaky breaths. "This isn't something we can just work through together. This is something that could tear our family apart. The children. Oh God, what will this do to our children?" The mention of their children sent a spike of fear through William's chest. Whatever this secret involved, it was serious enough to potentially impact George, Charlotte, and Louis. His protective instincts kicked in fully, and he gripped Kate's shoulders gently but firmly. "Tell me what's happening," he said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority. "Whatever it is, keeping it from me isn't protecting anyone. If our family is at risk, I need to know about it." Kate looked up at him with red, swollen eyes, and for a moment, William thought she was going to confess everything. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but then she seemed to change her mind and shook her head violently. "I can't," she whispered. "I promised her I wouldn't tell anyone, not yet. She needs time to figure out how to handle this properly." "Her?" William seized on this information. "The woman who was here this morning? Kate, who was she? What did she tell you?" Kate moved away from him, walking to her desk and sitting down heavily in her chair. She looked exhausted, as if the emotional weight she was carrying had physically drained her. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water that sat on her desk. "Her name is Margaret Thompson," Kate said finally, her voice barely audible. "She used to work for the palace. Years ago, before we were married. She was in a position where she had access to sensitive information." William felt his stomach drop. Palace staff who had access to sensitive information could know things about the royal family that were never meant to become public. The possibilities of what Margaret Thompson might have revealed to Kate were numerous and terrifying. "What kind of sensitive information?" he pressed, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Kate was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she finally looked up at him, her expression was filled with a mixture of love and profound sadness that made William's heart ache. "Information about your father," she said quietly. "About things that happened before you were born. Things that could change how the public sees the monarchy, how they see our family." William felt the blood drain from his face. His father, King Charles, had lived through numerous scandals and controversies throughout his life. Most of them had eventually become public knowledge and had been weathered with varying degrees of success. But if Margaret Thompson had information that was still secret after all these years, it had to be something truly significant. "What about my father?" William asked, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Kate stood up again, pacing to the window and back to her desk in an agitated manner. "William, your father doesn't know she came here. She said she's been carrying this secret for decades, but recent events have made her feel like she can't stay silent anymore. She's terrified of what might happen if the information comes out, but she's also terrified of what might happen if it doesn't." "What kind of recent events?" William demanded, his patience wearing thin. The vague answers were making his anxiety worse, not better. "The documentary," Kate said, referring to a recent television program that had examined various aspects of royal history. She saw some of the claims being made, some of the speculation about events from that time period, and she realized that the truth might come out anyway. She wanted to give us a chance to prepare, to decide how to handle it before someone else discovers what she knows. William sank into the chair across from Kate's desk, trying to process what she was telling him. A secret about his father that had been hidden for decades, something serious enough to potentially damage the monarchy's reputation, and now a former palace employee was threatening to reveal it. "What exactly does she know?" he asked, dreading the answer. Kate's face crumpled again and fresh tears began to flow down her cheeks. "She has proof, William. Documents, photographs, witness statements. She's kept everything all these years because she didn't know what else to do with it." "Proof of what?" William's voice was barely a whisper now. Kate looked at him with eyes full of pain and regret. "Proof that your father had an affair we never knew about. An affair that produced a child. William, you have a half-brother and he's been living in Australia for the past 35 years, completely unaware of who his real father is." William stared at Kate in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what she had just revealed. A half-brother. In Australia. For 35 years? The implications were staggering, not just for their family, but for the entire royal succession and the public's perception of the monarchy. That's impossible, he said finally, his voice hoarse. My father. He would have told me. The palace would have known. There are protocols, investigations, background checks on everyone who comes into contact with the royal family. Kate wiped her eyes again, trying to steady her voice. According to Margaret, this happened in 1988, during a private visit your father made to Australia. He was still married to your mother, but their relationship was already strained. The woman was a local liaison officer assigned to help with his visit. She was young, intelligent, and completely devoted to making his trip successful. William felt sick. 1988 would have been during some of the most difficult years of his parents' marriage, when the tensions between Charles and Diana were becoming increasingly obvious to those around them, though not yet public knowledge. Margaret was part of the security detail for that trip, Kate continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the burden of knowledge. She said your father and this woman, Sarah Collins, spent a lot of time together discussing local history and cultural sites. It started innocently, but by the end of the 2-week visit they had become very close. William stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Even if that's true, it doesn't prove anything. My father has always been interested in history and culture. He's had many platonic relationships with experts and liaisons over the years. William, Kate said gently, Margaret has photographs, not compromising ones, but pictures that show them together in situations that were clearly personal, rather than professional. She also has copies of letters your father sent to Sarah after he returned to England. The room felt like it was spinning. William gripped the back of the chair he had been sitting in, trying to anchor himself to something solid. Letters? Love letters, Kate confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret said Sarah kept them all, along with a locket your father gave her as a parting gift. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant 3 months after your father's visit, she confided in Margaret because she didn't know what else to do. William's legs felt weak, and he sank back into the chair. Why didn't she contact my father? Why didn't she tell the palace? She was terrified, Kate explained. She was a single woman in her 20s who had become pregnant by a married prince. She was afraid of what it would do to your parents' marriage, what it would mean for you and Harry, what kind of scandal it would create. Margaret said Sarah was convinced that coming forward would destroy not just her own life, but potentially damage the monarchy itself. So she just kept quiet? Raised the child alone? Kate nodded sadly. She moved to a different city, changed her name slightly, and raised the boy as a single mother. She told him his father had died in an accident before he was born. Margaret said she sent regular updates about the child to your father for the first few years, through a private postal box, but she never received any responses. William felt a wave of nausea wash over him. My father knew. Margaret thinks he knew, yes, but she also thinks he made a conscious decision not to acknowledge the situation, probably on the advice of palace officials who were already dealing with the problems in his marriage to your mother. The silence in the room was deafening as William tried to absorb this information. Somewhere in Australia was a man who was his half-brother, a man who had grown up without knowing his true heritage, without the privileges and burdens that came with royal blood, but also without a father. What's his name? William asked quietly. James, Kate replied. James Collins. He's a teacher now, married with 2 children of his own. Margaret said he's a good man, kind and intelligent with a strong sense of social responsibility. He volunteers with disadvantaged youth and has no idea that he's technically a member of the royal family. William put his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the enormity of what Kate was telling him. Why is Margaret coming forward now? After all these years, why does she want to reveal this? Kate hesitated before answering. She's been diagnosed with terminal cancer. She has maybe 6 months to live, and she said she can't take this secret to her grave. She feels guilty about keeping it for so long, especially knowing that James has a right to know who his father is. And Sarah, the mother? She died in a car accident 8 years ago. Margaret said she made her promise on her deathbed to never tell James the truth. But now Margaret's conscience is eating at her. She's torn between honoring her friend's dying wish and believing that everyone deserves to know their true identity. William looked up at his wife, seeing the pain in her eyes that reflected his own emotional turmoil. What does she want from us? She wants to meet with your father first, to give him a chance to decide how to handle this before she approaches James directly. She said she owes your father that much given how long she's kept his secret. The thought of his father's reaction to this news was almost as troubling as the revelation itself. Charles had spent years rebuilding his reputation after the scandals of the 1990s. A revelation like this could undo decades of careful rehabilitation and potentially affect the stability of his reign. Kate, William said slowly, if this becomes public, it won't just affect my father. It will impact all of us. The children will have to grow up knowing they have an uncle they've never met, dealing with questions about family secrets and hidden scandals. Kate nodded, fresh tears starting to flow again. I know, that's why I've been so upset. I keep thinking about George, Charlotte, and Louis having to face reporters asking them about their grandfather's secret son. I think about this James Collins suddenly being thrust into the spotlight, his privacy destroyed, his children's lives changed forever. William reached across the desk and took Kate's hands in his. What did you tell Margaret? I told her I needed time to think, time to discuss it with you. She's given us 2 weeks to decide what we want to do before she takes matters into her own hands. 2 weeks. William stared at their joined hands, trying to comprehend how such a short period of time could hold the potential to change everything they knew about their family. The weight of the decision ahead of them felt overwhelming, and he could understand why Kate had been so devastated by the news. Where is the evidence now? He asked, trying to think practically about the situation. The letters, the photographs, all of it? Margaret has everything secured in a safe deposit box, Kate replied. She showed me copies this morning, but the originals are safely locked away. She said she's written detailed instructions about what should be done with the materials if something happens to her before this is resolved. William felt a chill at the implication. If Margaret died unexpectedly, there was no telling who might gain access to those documents or how they might choose to use them. The situation could spiral completely out of their control. What were the letters like? He asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the details. Kate looked uncomfortable with the question. They were personal, romantic. Your father wrote about how much he missed Sarah, how their time together had meant something special to him. There were mentions of wanting to see her again, of wishing circumstances were different. William closed his eyes, imagining his father as a young man, trapped in an unhappy marriage, finding solace with someone who understood and cared for him. In some ways it was heartbreaking rather than scandalous, but he knew the public wouldn't see it that way. Did he know about the pregnancy when he wrote those letters? Margaret thinks so. The last few letters she showed me had references to taking responsibility and doing what's right. But they were vague. It's possible he was trying to figure out how to handle the situation without putting it in writing explicitly. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the implications of this revelation. Finally, William spoke again. We have to tell my father immediately. He needs to know that Margaret is planning to come forward regardless of what we decide to do. Kate nodded reluctantly. I know you're right, but I'm dreading that conversation. How do you tell someone that a secret they thought was buried forever is about to be exposed? Very carefully, William replied grimly. And privately. We can't risk anyone else overhearing this conversation. What about Harry? Kate asked. Don't you think your brother has a right to know about this too? If he finds out later that we kept this from him? William hadn't even considered how Harry would react to learning he had another brother. The relationship between William and Harry had been strained in recent years, and adding this bombshell to their already complicated dynamic could make things even worse. One crisis at a time, he said finally. Let's talk to my father first and see how he wants to handle telling the rest of the family. Kate squeezed his hands. William, what if your father asks us to try to convince Margaret to stay silent? What if he wants us to offer her money, or make some other arrangement to keep this quiet? The question hit at the heart of William's moral dilemma. On one hand, he understood the desire to protect their family from scandal and preserve the stability of the monarchy. On the other hand, somewhere in Australia was a man who had lived his entire life not knowing his true identity, and that man had children who were technically William's niece and nephew. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me thinks this James Collins has a right to know who his father is, especially if he wants to have any kind of relationship with his biological family. But another part of me is terrified of what this revelation could do to our children, to the monarchy, to everything we've worked to build. Kate pulled her hands free and stood up, walking to her desk drawer. She pulled out a small key and unlocked the bottom drawer, withdrawing a manila envelope identical to the one William had seen that morning. She left copies with me, Kate explained, seeing William's surprised expression. She said she wanted us to have time to review everything thoroughly before making our decision. William stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. Inside those papers was proof of a family secret that had been hidden for over 3 decades, evidence that could potentially alter the course of royal history. The rational part of his mind knew he needed to examine the documents, but emotionally, he wasn't ready to see his father's private letters or photographs that proved his infidelity. "Have you looked through everything?" he asked. Kate shook her head. "I couldn't bring myself to do it. After Margaret explained what it all meant, I just put the envelope in my drawer and tried to pretend this morning never happened." William understood the impulse completely. There was a part of him that wanted to burn the envelope without opening it, to pretend that Margaret Thompson had never existed and that their biggest worry was still which charitable events to attend next week, but he also knew that ignorance wouldn't protect them if Margaret decided to go public with her information. They needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with, how strong the evidence was, and what kind of questions they would face if this story broke in the media. "We should look at it together," he said finally. "Tonight, after the children are in bed, we need to know what we're up against." Kate nodded, though she looked pale at the prospect. "And then?" "Then we call my father and arrange an emergency meeting." "This can't wait, Kate. Every day we delay increases the risk that this will blow up in our faces." As if summoned by their conversation about the children, they heard young voices in the hallway outside Kate's study. George, Charlotte, and Louis were home from school, their cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere in the room. Kate quickly wiped her eyes and checked her appearance in a small mirror on her desk. "I need to pull myself together. They can't see me like this." William stood and helped smooth Kate's hair, trying to erase any remaining signs of her emotional breakdown. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." But even as he spoke the comforting words, William couldn't shake the feeling that their family was about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. And there was no going back to the innocence they had lost that morning. The door opened before they could knock, and Charles's butler greeted them with his usual formal courtesy. "His Majesty is waiting for you in the blue drawing room," he announced, leading them down the familiar hallway. William felt Kate's hand slip into his as they approached the door where his father waited, unknowing and unprepared for the revelation that would force him to confront the choices of his youth and their consequences. The future of their family, and perhaps the monarchy itself, hung in the balance of the conversation they were about to have. That evening, after the children had been fed, bathed, and tucked into their beds with their usual bedtime stories, William and Kate sat in their private sitting room with the manila envelope placed on the coffee table between them. Neither had spoken much during dinner, both lost in their own thoughts about what they were about to discover. The house felt unusually quiet, as if even the ancient walls of Kensington Palace were holding their breath in anticipation of the secrets about to be revealed. William poured himself a whiskey, something he rarely did, but the circumstances seemed to call for liquid courage. "Are you ready?" Kate asked, though her own reluctance was obvious in her voice. William nodded and reached for the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal and pulled out the contents. The first item was a cover letter from Margaret Thompson, written in neat handwriting on official-looking letterhead. As he read Margaret's letter aloud, the story unfolded exactly as Kate had described it earlier. Margaret's guilt over keeping the secret for so long was evident in every carefully chosen word. She wrote about Sarah Collins with genuine affection and respect, describing her as a woman who had sacrificed her own happiness to protect the royal family from scandal. The photographs came next. They were clearly from the 1980s, showing a younger version of Charles with a beautiful woman who had kind eyes and a warm smile. The pictures weren't compromising in an obvious way, but they showed an intimacy that went beyond professional courtesy. In one photo, Charles had his hand on Sarah's shoulder as they looked at something together. In another, they were walking side by side through what appeared to be a park, their body language suggesting comfortable familiarity. But it was the letters that truly revealed the depth of the relationship. William's father had written to Sarah Collins regularly for nearly 2 years, and his affection for her was unmistakable. The early letters were cautious, focusing on shared interests and intellectual discussions, but they gradually became more personal and emotional. In one particularly revealing letter, Charles wrote about how Sarah had brought joy and understanding into his life during a period when he felt isolated and misunderstood. He expressed regret about the circumstances that kept them apart and wondered aloud about what might have been possible if their situations had been different. The final letters were the most difficult to read. Charles wrote about wanting to do the right thing, about his responsibilities to his family and his position, but also about his deep care for Sarah and their unborn child. He promised to ensure that she and the baby would be financially secure, but acknowledged that he couldn't publicly acknowledge his son without destroying his marriage and potentially damaging the monarchy. Kate watched William's face as he read the letters, seeing the pain and confusion in his expressions. This wasn't the father he knew, or at least it wasn't a side of his father he had ever seen before. The Charles revealed in these letters was vulnerable, conflicted, and deeply human in ways that the public persona never allowed. "There's more," Kate said quietly, pointing to another section of documents that William hadn't yet examined. These papers were more recent, dating from just a few months earlier. They were investigative reports that Margaret had apparently commissioned from a private detective, tracking down information about James Collins and his current life in Australia. James Collins was 34 years old, exactly the age he would be if he had been born 9 months after Charles's 1988 visit to Australia. He was a high school history teacher in Melbourne, married to a nurse named Emma, with twin daughters who were 7 years old. The physical resemblance to the royal family was striking in the photographs the investigator had obtained. But what was most remarkable about James Collins was how his life had unfolded. Despite growing up without knowing his royal heritage, he had developed many of the same interests and values that characterized the Windsor family. He was actively involved in environmental conservation efforts, worked with underprivileged youth, and had even written several articles about British history that had been published in academic journals. "It's like he inherited more than just physical traits," Kate observed, studying the photographs of James with his family, his sense of duty, his interests, even the way he carries himself. "It's also familiar." William stared at a picture of James Collins teaching a class, gesturing animatedly as he explained something to his students. The resemblance to Charles was undeniable, but there was also something of William himself in the man's features and bearing. "Those are my nieces," William said suddenly, pointing to the photographs of James's twin daughters. "Those little girls playing in that garden are Charlotte and Louis's cousins, and they have no idea we exist." The reality of the situation hit them both with fresh force. This wasn't just about a secret from the past. It was about living people who were part of their extended family, people who had been denied the chance to know their relatives and their true heritage. William's phone buzzed with a text message, startling them both. It was from Charles, asking if William and Kate would be available for lunch the following day to discuss some upcoming royal engagements. The innocent nature of the message, given what they had just learned, felt almost surreal. "We have to tell him tomorrow," William said, setting his phone aside. "I can't look at my father and pretend I don't know about this. And we can't risk Margaret approaching him without warning." Kate gathered the documents carefully, placing them back in the envelope. "What do you think he'll say? How do you think he'll react when he realizes that his secret is about to come out after all these years?" William considered the question seriously. His father was a complex man who had weathered numerous scandals and challenges throughout his life. He had learned to be pragmatic about crisis management, but this situation was unlike anything he had faced before. "I think he'll be devastated," William said finally, "not just because of the potential public reaction, but because he'll have to confront the choices he made all those years ago. He spent decades trying to be a good father to us, and now he'll have to face the fact that he has another son who grew up without him." Kate stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the London skyline twinkling in the darkness. "What if James Collins doesn't want anything to do with us? What if he's happy with his life as it is and sees this revelation as nothing but an unwelcome intrusion?" It was a possibility William hadn't fully considered. They had been so focused on the potential damage to their own family that they hadn't thought much about how this news might affect James and his family, a man who had lived his entire life believing his father was dead. might not welcome the discovery that his father was actually alive and had chosen not to be part of his life, then we'll respect his wishes, William said. But he deserves the chance to make that choice for himself. Margaret is right about that much. As they prepared for bed that night, both William and Kate moved through their usual routines mechanically, their minds preoccupied with the impossible decision they faced. They lay in bed in silence for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts about what the next day would bring. "William," Kate whispered in the darkness, "what if this destroys your father's reign? What if the public decides they can't trust the monarchy anymore after learning about this secret?" William reached for her hand under the covers. "Then we'll deal with that too. The monarchy has survived scandals before. We're stronger than we sometimes think." But privately, William wasn't sure if that was true. The royal family's relationship with the British public was complicated and fragile, built on a delicate balance of tradition, respect, and transparency. A revelation like this could tip that balance in unpredictable ways. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood that had settled over their household. William called his father's private secretary and arranged for an urgent private meeting, citing sensitive family matters that required immediate attention. Charles agreed to see them that afternoon at Clarence House, though his secretary noted that the king seemed puzzled by the mysterious nature of the request. As they drove through London toward the meeting that would change everything, William and Kate sat in tense silence. The envelope containing Margaret Thompson's evidence rested in William's briefcase, a ticking time bomb that would soon explode the careful equilibrium of their lives. "Whatever happens," Kate said as their car pulled up to Clarence House, "we face it together. All of us, that's what families do." William squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her courage and determination. In a few minutes, they would walk through that door and deliver news that would force his father to confront the most difficult chapter of his past. There would be no going back to the innocence of yesterday morning, when their biggest concern had been which charities to support and which public appearances to make. As they stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance of Clarence House, William couldn't help but think about James Collins in Melbourne, going about his normal day as a teacher, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. In a matter of days or weeks, that man's quiet life would be turned upside down by a truth that had been hidden for 35 years.